into the third part of or third session on the prophetic books. But still, I am not ready to go for a study of the individual prophetic books, because we know that the prophetic movement or the movement of the classical prophet begins in the 8th century. So it's important that we review the 8th century, the historical background of the 8th century Israel and Judah. So whatever we covered so far is that in the first lesson we had an overview of the prophetic movement. Universal, the human tendency to know the will of God or what the future and all that, and prophetic movement or prophets is part of that movement. And we also saw the prophetic movement before the monarchy in Israel, that is the days of Abraham and Moses and people like that. And then during the period of the monarchy, Elijah and Elisha and all that. But those who did not leave us a record of their life and activities, or nobody collected that as separate books, but these are embedded in the historical narratives of Israel or the people of God. Now, then comes a period when the prophetic books were collected and codified, and we have it in the present form. So in the second part of the study or the second study, we looked at the place or where are the prophetic books found in the canon or the list of or the order of the prophetic books in the Bible. And we also looked at how a prophetic book is formed or came to the present form that we have. Because in those busy days of ministry, they were not sitting down everything. They might have preached orally, they might have written down something, but there are disciples and followers and schools of thought around them. They compiled them into books. And then as part of that study, we also looked at the different layers and levels of meanings that the prophetic books have, and how do we understand the prophetic books. Or simply put, it is as simple as saying how we can understand or how can we read the prophetic books. The objective of the lesson today is to give us a historical background of these books. I'm no more talking about the prophetic movement as a movement of prophets. From time to time, in different historical situations, God raised his spokesmen who challenged the kings and the rulers and the people, even priests and the false prophets also, and who asked them to come back to the ways of the Lord, the Yahweh, and if not, they were threatened with punishment or judgment. So we need to look at that historical background briefly today, and before we move on to the study of the individual books of the prophets of 8th century. So what I'm going to do now is to look at the 8th century prophets or prophets who prophesied in the 8th century. Now, I should have given you some suggestions in the last few classes that all these historical backgrounds are found in the books of Samuel and Kings and also Chronicles. But essentially, we should have read at least the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, as a background to this. But anyway, I'm not going to details of, I'm going to read passages from these books, but I hope that after this class, you will have an opportunity to read these 4 books before the next class, before we move into the study of Book of Amos. But it's not fair from my side to just give you a gist of, or what is the main intent of these books. Why were these books, Samuel and Kings, were written? These historical books where we have the activities of the prophets recorded. For example, Prophet Samuel, Prophet Elijah, Prophet Elisha, Prophet Ahijah, and all these prophets who are pre-monarchical prophet or non-canonical prophets. They are there, and we also have provided with historical backgrounds against which we should read the prophets. If you ask me to summarize the whole intent or why these Samuel Kings or books of Samuel and Kings were written, it was written is simply to explain. There are various other secondary or tertiary purposes, but the main purpose is or seems to be to explain how Israel lost the kingdoms to foreign powers. Why northern Israel fell into the hands of Assyrians and completely annihilated. How the southern kingdom went into Babylonian captivity. So these books were explaining, or is a warning, I would say, rather a warning to the readers or to the later generations of Israelites that this is the reason, that is, disobedience of the kings and their people, and not willing to listen to the words of Yahweh's prophets, true prophets, and going after the false prophets and believing lies instead of the truth that the prophets, the true prophets of Yahweh, true spokesmen of Yahweh spoke. Their unwillingness to listen to the voice of the Lord, voice of their God, is the reason why they went into exile. Rather dramatically, the second Kings ends with a report of the number of deportees, number of people who are taken to Babylon, and the story ends there. It's a climax. First and Second Chronicles is basically a retelling of the same thing from a later period. But let's just focus on First and Second Samuel. So the history that they are called historical books in the canon. The history in Samuel and Kings, the books of Samuel and Kings, is to tell us why one after another, the kings displeased Yahweh. They did not listen to his words through the prophets, and how they lost the kingdom, why we went into the kingdom. The writers of Kings and Samuel want their generations to remember that story. It is our sins. That is why Ezekiel would say, or Nehemiah would say, we and our fathers have sinned in exile, because they realized that it is their fault. They should have listened to the voice. That's so the history has a warning. History comes with a warning, which is recorded in the Bible. Now, I'm moving into, so I just told you the purpose of history. The history of Israel that is recorded is telling us very loudly that Israel lost the kingdom because they ignored their prophets. Now let's look at the history of the 8th century. But before we go into the history of the 8th century, we should look at the dawn. What was happening at the dawn of the 8th century? So otherwise I should say that I should look at the background of the 8th century. In the 8th century, when Israel entered 8th century, some things have already happened. The first thing that's the first notable thing that I have to say. I'm not actually, we have to notice that the fall of the kingdom. But let me say that I'm not going to review the history from their monarchy to this point, to 8th century, basically 200 years. But I'm just saying that what happened at the dawn, or when we wake up in the 8th century, what is the reality that is waiting for us? First, we see two kingdoms. At the beginning, if you start reading history at that point, we see that the kingdom of David, that David established, of the 12 tribes, have already collapsed or fragmented. This is how it happened. In BC 922, Solomon son of David, died. But David had united Israel, and he had also subdued all the neighboring countries like Edom in the south, far south, and Philistia in the southwestern side, the Ammonites and Moabites on the western side, beyond the other side of Jordan, and Syria and Damascus, and all these countries. He had subdued all of them, and he had built an empire which he passed on to his son. Though he lost a little bit of control, but the kingdom of David was intact. But after Solomon's time, when Rehoboam, Solomon's very unwise, foolish son, became king, the 10 northern tribes rebelled under a person called Jeroboam. And you can read the story in 1 Kings 12, chapters 1 to 20. And in a nutshell, what happened is that the kingdom was split into two. The 10 northern tribes established a separate kingdom, which from now on I will refer to the northern Israel. Okay, when I say Israel, I mean the people of God, the 12 tribes. When I say northern Israel, I specifically mean the northern kingdom established by Jeroboam by defying or by rebelling against the Davidic dynasty under Rehoboam. So the kingdom was divided. What is the consequence of the division? The Davidic empire collapsed first of all into two. That is, the Davidic empire, or the empire of David, which Solomon presided, is divided now into two pieces. One is called Northern Israel, and the other called the Southern Kingdom, which is Judah, with two tribes, Benjamin and Judah. Now, this creates immense problems. First of all, the division actually created two rival states. Something like what happened in India in 1947. Whatever was so far united under the British Empire, divided into Pakistan and India, and that means that is where the enmity, hostility of the two neighboring countries began. In a similar manner, Northern Israel and Judah, except for a few short periods, they were always at enmity. They were hostile nations. The same people of God, worshipping the same Yahweh. Northern Israel also had worshipped Yahweh. So they had the same traditions. They believed that they came through Exodus. They were slaves in Egypt. God made a covenant with them. All these 10 tribes believed in all these things. But Judah also believed the same thing. But they are now two different rival states at each other's throat. Not only that, the dependent kingdoms, or the kingdoms that David had absorbed into his large empire, like Philistines, Moabites, and Edomites, Ammonites, and the Arameans, and all these, they started rebelling. So, what happens is that in South, Edom declared independence. Philistia was not more controlled by Judah because they are already weak states, very weak second grade states. They could not control the western side of Jordan, that is Ammon and Moab. They could not control the northern side like Damascus and Syria. They lost the empire. Not only the nations were divided into two, the empire disintegrated. And not only that, each part of the disintegrated empire were against these nations of Northern Israel and Judah as well. So they lost peace in the nation, and warfare became a daily affair. These are economic consequences as well, serious economic consequences, because the empire of David and Solomon were rich because they were getting tributes, taxes from the people whom they had subdued. Philistines were paying taxes, tributes, and Edomites and Syrians and all these countries, nations, were paying taxes. So Jerusalem, the Davidic empire, was very rich. Solomon's empire was so rich. That explains Solomon's the extravaganza of Solomon building temples and gardens and things and that and all, because he had a lot of revenue flowing into his empire. But they stopped because they were rebelling. All these neighbors were rebelling. Another reason is that they lost control over the trade routes. Controlling the trade routes that pass through the sea coast and through the Transjordan, that is Ammon and Moab, and also access to the port of Ezion-Geber in Red Sea. So please consult a map at this point. At sea when you had access to Ezion-Geber, that means you had access to the rest of the world. That means the southern side of the world. That through Red Sea to Arabian Sea and the rest of the whole world, Indian Ocean and all that nations they could trade with. Solomon did that. Solomon even traded with Somalia and probably India as well. And he had a lot of things that he could trade with people. Arabian horses from or Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia. So, but now they lost all the control. See, no, they could not use the King's Highway, which passed through Ammon and Moab, which is present Transjordan, for trade. It was cut off. And they could not use this Via Maria, which went through the western side, through Philistia, because the Sharon Valley and Philistia on the western side. Yes. Yeah, western side, I'm sorry. So because the Philistines controlled that, but they can use it, but they have to pay heavy taxes and all that, toll. So it also had some economic implications for them. Now, this is the situation at the dawn of the 8th century. This is the situation that we face. Now, let us look at the independent kingdoms these two kingdoms at 8th century. Instability in northern Israel. The 10 tribes which formed northern Israel. Instability was the hallmark, political instability. During a period of 40 years, from the days of Jeroboam I till the fall of Samaria, northern kingdom, to the Assyrians, it's just 40 years. I think I'm just calculating, I'm talking about the Jeroboam II, the son of Jeroboam I. Okay, he came to power in 786 BC, and Samaria fell in the days of the last king Osaya in 721. So in my quick math, this is about 40 years, or is it 60 years? Yeah, I think it's 60 years. From Jeroboam II to Hosea 721. In the short period of 60 years, they had 7 kings in northern Israel. Jeroboam, followed by Zechariah, who reigned only for 1 year, followed by Shallum, whom reigned less than 1 year, Menahem, who was probably served maybe about 12 years longer, Pekah, just 1 year, and Pekahiah, and Pekah for 4 years, and finally Hosea for about a decade. Now, why? Because the northern Israel, which Jeroboam I founded, it always had revolts after revolts. I told you, why Shallum could not complete 1 year in the throne, because he was overthrown. Some were assassinated. Pekahiah was assassinated, and so it was not. They are not the descendants. There was no dynasty at all. See, David was promised a dynasty. That is, Nathan came to him in read 2 Samuel 7. And when David said that I want to build a house or a temple for the Lord, a worship place for the Lord, God told Nathan to go and tell him that you are not going to build a house for me, but I will build your house, which meant, it was a pun. The house that David wanted to build was the temple. The same Hebrew word is used for a dynasty, Beit, the dynasty. So God said, no, 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 you are a good man, you have a good intentions, I honor your good intentions because you love me and all that. But wait, your son will do that, but you won't do that. But I am going to do you a favor. I will be you build your dynasty. You will always have one of your descendants to sit on your throne. But Jeroboam was also given such a promise by Ahijah, who actually instigated him against Rehoboam to become king of northern Israel. But when we discussed that last week, and when Jeroboam sinned, Ahijah withdrew that promise of God. So because of that, from the day one, northern Israel did not find favor with God. There was always coup, bloodshed, and no stability at all. And to add to that, they could not, because of this instability, they could not build a capital city. Even Jeroboam moved on from one place to another. So all the kings in his time, except a brief dynasty of the Omrites, Omri, Simri, and that dynasty, they had a short dynasty and they had built Samaria as their capital. Otherwise, this was a very, very unstable kingdom. So it is against this background of instability and all that, and some prophets also instigated these coup, these revolts, rebellions. We'll see that if you can see that when you read the books of Samuel and Kings. And then not only economic problems, not only political problems of instability, coup after coup after coup, rebellion after rebellion after rebellion. How can a country progress when every ruler, head of the state, is being assassinated? You have a history of military coups. Now, to add the problem, there was religious decay. Jeroboam 1, it begins with Jeroboam 1. Jeroboam 1 was smart, but he was always against the Lord. When he took over, one of the things he did was to build 2 temples for Yahweh, one in the northern side, that is Dan, and one in the southern side of his kingdom in Bethel. The 2 Yahwistic shrines of Bethel, Dan, and Bethel. You know why I said he is smart? He did it so that the people, the religion is same. Everybody believed in Yahweh, everybody believed in Exodus, everybody believed that God has given them the promised land. Even the 10 tribes believed that. So he thought that during the annual festivals, the people in the northern kingdom, the people of his kingdom, may go to Jerusalem to celebrate, and they may become more sympathetic to the Davidic rulers. So they may defect. So in order to stop pilgrimages to Jerusalem or to the southern kingdom, he said, look, here we have our temples, Yahwistic temples, one in Bethel for the northern people to go there, you have access there. Sorry, one in Dan where the northern tribes can go, it's very convenient, and the southern tribes can go to, southern people in the southern part of the kingdom go to Bethel. But he established or he installed 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and in one in. So they worshipped golden calves, but they were worshipping Yahweh. They were Yahwehs. They had almost the same scriptures and traditions and beliefs and all that. But he, in order to stop people going to south, he made a local shrines. And he also, not only that, he expelled the Levites, the people of the tribe of Levi, or any Aaronic people of Aaron's family from priesthood, because he had to have priests for both these temples, shrines that here where golden calves are worshipped in the name of Yahweh, or Yahweh is worshipped as golden calves. He expelled the Levites as priests, and he said anyone who can do these rituals can be priests. So he put an end to the Levitical priesthood. And now it is very clear by now that this nation, northern Israel, become a syncretic nation, a syncretic religion. There is idolatry, and there was they did not no more believe in the central shrine or where Yahweh dwells in Jerusalem. And the third impact in northern Israel or aspect is social decay. They forgot what the Lord, the righteousness and justice of God. The typical example is what happens in the days of Ahab. This is just before 8th century. But just an example, a typical example, this is during the days of Elijah. So, but I still would like to use that to show you what was happening. There was no respect for the covenant of Yahweh. That Yahweh's covenant is that everybody should maintain the tribal allotments, lands that Joshua has assigned to them. And king has no particular right on that, no prerogatives on that. Now, this is what happened in the case of Naboth. Now, the Naboth's case, though it happens a century before prophets came into the classical prophets came into the scene, it is during the days of Elijah. It is still a example illustrates what the social decay that was happening in 8th century also is continued in the 8th century as well. What happened is there the king took the land of Naboth, and before killing he justified it by condemning him, bringing false witnesses, and there was no right, there was no respect of the life of an innocent man, and the royal power was misused in order to confiscate. When we read the 8th century prophets, we'll see many echoes of such things throughout. Though I gave you one example only, and that happened a century before this whole thing happened. But I'm just telling you that when we read, we should remember in mind that the respect for the covenant of the Lord, the equality, social justice, and all that God expected had no place in northern Israel. So that is the background against which we would see the prophets of the 8th century. Now, what was the situation in Judah, the southern kingdom? Things were not very different. But you can divide this into two parts. Now, everything that happens in Palestine, both the northern kingdom and Judah, are dependent on who rules the northern part of the world and the southern part. Who are the rulers in Egypt and who are the rulers in Mesopotamia, Assyria, Persia, and Babylon. But the first part of the 8th century was a period when there were no significant superpowers either in Mesopotamia in the northern part nor in Egypt in the southern part. These superpowers, they were very, very, very weak. The first king that we see in the 8th century that we would meet now in the 8th century is King Osaya. In some passages, his name is mentioned as Azariah. Azariah and Osaya are the two names of the same person who ruled Judah from Jerusalem from 783 to almost 742. His rule was very good. Sometimes we can call it a sort of a golden days of the southern kingdom. First of all, his contemporary in northern Israel was Jeroboam II, the son of the founder of northern Israel. That is Jeroboam I. His son, Jeroboam II, was ruling northern Israel. And Osaya was so smart in his diplomatic policies that he had a very good relationship with his northern neighbor, Jeroboam II. So there were no wars during that period. The two nations, the people of God, they had peace between. And this peace, he took advantage. Osaya took advantage. He was a very smart king, at least as far as politics is concerned. He regained the control of Ammon, that is the other side of Jordan. He made them pay tribute. So what we call the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan now. He was also able to control the Philistines in the southwest. And he had again regained access to Ezion-Geber, the port Ezion-Geber, so that he can have maritime trade. And he also had access to Tyre, what is present-day Lebanon, so that he had access to the Mediterranean Sea. Through that, the rest of the southern side of Asia, Turkey, underbelly of Turkey, and Europe. So Osaya actually, in a sense, regained the influence that David and Solomon had. Now, not only Bible, but many archaeological discoveries have shown that during the days of Uzziah, it was definitely a prosperous time for Israel. There was tremendous economic prosperity. He also had some military development as far as military is concerned and administration is concerned. And also in farming, for example, he had built farming houses or farms in the Judean wilderness, and built wells and watchtowers and all that. We read about that story in the book of Kings. He renovated Jerusalem because he had peace, no time, he was not wasting his resources on battles and wars and things like that. He fortified it, made it much more stronger. But Assyria or Uzziah, he had a sad end. You know the story that he broke into, in a sense we can use that word, broke into the Holy of Holies, or with the incense in his hands, defying the presiding priests, and he turned leper. He became leprous, and he was banished from the presence of the Lord. And he was banished, in a sense, from the palace also, or he was quarantined in the corner of his palace. And his son Jotham became the co-regent. He continued to be king until his death, but his son became the co-regent. His name is Jotham. And even now, if you go to Jerusalem, you can see how Osaya, even after his death, was treated. There, across the Kidron Valley, there is a small tomb, and there is a inscription was found many years. And I think it's the 19th century AD or 20th century AD, when people were digging for building houses, when Jerusalem was expanding, they found a small inscription which says, "Here the bones of Uzziah the king who became a leper is interned," or is kept. Stay away from it. Now, archaeologists found that when they were digging, when the JCB was digging these walls, this is what they found. I think this is kept now in the Museum of Israel. What I'm trying to say is that though he was a successful great king, Uzziah, he was detested even after his death. The later generations would stay away from the tomb where he was buried. If you go to Jerusalem, you can go down the Kidron Valley, and through the telescopes you can see the other side where these inscriptions are. The inscription was placed some years ago. So that was a sad end of Uzziah. And his son, who was co-regent, he reigned for another 7 years after Uzziah died. But he was just continued the policies of his father, and he was a less illustrious king. But his time was again continued the security and the political stability and the prosperity, economic prosperity of his dad. But after their death, the second half of the 8th century was a very crucial period. This is the period when the Davidic line continues, dynasty continues, one king after another, all from the family of David. Now this time we begin with Ahaz, the son of Jotham, Uzziah's grandson. He ruled from 735 to 715, which is almost 20 years, 2 decades. But by the time Assyria had come back to supremacy. They have become, under various Tiglath-Pileser, who is called fool in our Bibles, Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyria has come back to its prominence. It had started threatening, or it was expanding in the northern part, expanding its empire. So Ahaz had to reign during that period of the Assyrian dominance. You can read about his reign in 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 25. Now, the southern nation or people, kingdom of Edom, revolted against him. So he lost control of the Edomite territory, which is part of the Saudi Arabia in the present days. So he lost control on the port of Ezion-Geber. So he lost control on sea trade through that to the southwestern side. And then Philistines on the southern side and the southwestern side, the Philistines revolted. So Ezion-Geber, you can imagine it as slightly towards the east, southeast, southwest Philistines. So trade routes were again affected. And the crucial thing that happened was what we call the Cyro-Ephraimite crisis. In some books you will read that it is called the Cyro-Ephraimite war. But nowadays we simply call it Cyro-Ephraimite crisis because we have no evidence whether a battle ever took place. But it was a crisis. What was the crisis? The crisis was when in 735, when Ahaz almost took over and was establishing himself in the kingdom of Judah, the northern Israel and the Aram, which is Syria. But I will continue to use the word Aram not to confuse with the present day Syria. It was not present day Syria, but it's almost the present day Syria. So Aram and Ephraim. Ephraim means northern Israel. They made an alliance. The reason could be this, that probably they made an alliance to revolt against Assyria. Or it could be that an alliance was made to attack Ahaz in Judah. We read about it in in Book of Isaiah chapter 7. Now, whatever the reason, the book of Isaiah says that he and his officers were very nervous because the strong alliance will come against them. Either the Syria and Ephraim wanted Ahaz to join them to revolt against Assyria, or they joined forces together. They made an alliance to attack Judah. We don't know what exactly, but Ahaz was so frightened. His officers were frightened. But what happened? Now, I'll talk more about it when we come to book of Isaiah. I'm skipping a little bit. So what Ahaz did is, against the advice that prophet Isaiah gave him, he sought help from Assyria. And the Assyrians duly helped. They were looking for an opportunity. They were looking for an opportunity to march towards south. So what they did is, they came and attacked Israel, northern Israel. They made big damage to Damascus, Syria, Aram. Okay. And then what happens there is that the Assyrian Empire, so they actually weakened the enemies of Ahaz or Judah, which Isaiah had already prophesied it will even otherwise happen. You don't have to go for the help of Assyria. But foolish, ungodly Ahaz rejected but now as a result of this, Assyria did come to help. Assyria actually destroyed in the sense weakened northern Israel and his other enemy called Aram. But the king of the Assyrian army did not return. They demanded a high price from Ahaz. That is, Ahaz became a sort of, in essence, not fully, a vassal king. He had to pay a huge tribute to Assyria. Then, but it's just a political implication. You know what? Now the faraway Assyria has now come to the doorsteps of Judah. Because northern Israel, their own people, are now subject to Assyria. Northern Israel is not destroyed yet. Okay, it took another 20 years. But so the Assyrian armies had free access, easy access to Judah. That is a foolishness. Now, secondly, another thing is that they took on the way, they thought, why don't we defeat the Philistines also? So Assyrians defeated Philistines. This story is not in the Bible, but we found archaeological evidences for that. And they had an Assyrian garrison in the southwestern frontier of Judah. That means from north and southwest, Assyrians had surrounded Judah. That was the foolishness that Ahaz did. And one day, we read it in the Second Kings, that Ahaz made a state visit or a courtesy visit to Assyria. Visited the king of Assyria, and Assyrian king gave him a blueprint of a Assyrian altar. He said, take this plan of the Assyrian altar and ask your carpenters and your architects to make a similar altar and install in the temple of Jerusalem. So the Jerusalem temple, he was forced to install a pagan altar, and we can read about that, and he had to cut off some access to the Jerusalem temple, to the place where the altar was there, and then the paganization of their religion accelerated. I will not say began. It accelerated. It gained momentum, and sadly, Ahaz became so paganized, went far away from Yahweh, the true God, that he even sacrificed his son alive. So he was so weakened in his faith and his religious faith, in his faith and loyalty to Yahweh, that he did what Yahweh had already prohibited through Moses, the lawgiver. He was not offering somebody else's son or person. He offered his own son on the altar. He went up in flames. That is how the sad story of Ahaz ends. And during the days of Ahaz, prophet Isaiah was the main prophet. We'll see more about his life and his message against this background. And Isaiah also ministered during the period of the next king, Ahaz's son, called Hezekiah, who ruled from 715 to 687 or 86. And that is the end of the 8th century. We are already into the 7th century by that. You can read about that, his rule, in 2 Chronicles 29 to 32, and also 2 Kings chapter 18 to 20. Take time to read that. He was a developer. He was a builder in a sense. He is the one who built the Siloam tunnel, which is still there. That is, from outside Jerusalem, from the Siloam pool, he built a tunnel through which water can come to inside the Jerusalem temple. That tunnel is still there. You can actually, if you want, to walk through that and from one end to the other through the tunnel. And that is a security measure, that in case of a siege, there will be plenty of water supply inside the temple. They can hold on. That was what he did. Moreover, he built many fortresses, and whatever fortresses were destroyed by anybody, by foreign enemies, he fortified it. He was getting ready to withstand a possible Assyrian threat. He overhauled the military. He made a lot of changes in military, brought new arms and equipment, horses and chariots and all that, which Isaiah very strongly criticized. That's another story. He built storehouses to store wine and oil and grain that in case if there is an attack either from Egypt or from Assyria, they will be able to hold on. They will be able to keep them out. He did all sort of things, but with all that, he had his own challenges. It is during his days that the new Assyrian king Sennacherib, who came to power in 701, around 701, started a campaign to southern part, that is to Syria and Palestine. And I should have told you that in 700, I think I have told you already, in 721 the northern Israel was gone. It was completely destroyed so it was an Assyrian province. It has crippled during the days of in 735 by Assyria, but now it is completely destroyed by the Assyrians in 721. So Sennacherib, the Babylonian king, he marched towards south and he devastated. And he actually weakened. Now he has a cylinder or an inscription where he talks about it. His campaign. He made Lachish in Judah his capital, and he tried to attack Jerusalem. He had laid siege to the city of God, Jerusalem, but God intervened miraculously, and through a miracle, Jerusalem was saved. So Hezekiah saved his life, and we will see all these dramatic events when we come to the book of Isaiah. So hold on. In next week we'll be talking about that, maybe a week after that. But he revived Yahweh. From his father had gone so backward in his faith, backslided in his faith to the extent of sacrificing his own, Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, to sacrifice his own brother. That is Hezekiah's brother. That was he was sacrificed by his father. But Hezekiah was against all that policies. So he revived Yahwism, the Yahwistic faith. He probably purged the temple of all the altars and things like that, as his father has done. Asherah poles, and he cleansed them all. There was a revival, and Jerusalem came back to its former glory. The festivals were celebrated, and in between, Hezekiah was a man of prayer who honored the prophets of God as well. So what happens is that one day he developed some ulcers, and he was sick and at the point of death, but he prayed to God, and God healed him and gave him another 15 years to his life. So Hezekiah was a man of God. He ended in a very good note. But here we will see his policies were not always what God wanted or in God's own way. So with that, we come to the end of the 8th century. And let me try to summarize it. In northern Israel, it was syncretic faith, though it is Yahwism. But they had a confidence. They had a misplaced optimism. They believed that they are the chosen people of God. And they also believed that there is a day called the Day of the Lord when God will punish their enemies and God will vindicate them. But the prophet Amos, who ministered during the days of Jeroboam, too, said this is a lie. Don't put your trust in that election to justify all the wrongs that you are doing. Don't believe that there is a day of vindication for you. No, God is not coming to vindicate a group of people who are worshipping golden calves and do all sorts of social injustice. The day of the Lord is not against your enemies. It is against the enemies of the Lord. So that was the message of Amos. Hold on, we will see that in detail in the next class. In a similar manner, the people of Judah also had false faith. They believed that I mentioned some minutes back that God has established a dynasty. The Davidic king, the kings of the Davidic dynasty has nothing to fear. God will protect them. God will always grant them success in everything they do. And believing in what we call the Davidic theology, that this faith, they forgot that the covenant that they had made with God at Horeb under the leadership of Moses, which laid down the conditions for their life before God, the 10 Commandments, the rules, the laws regarding social justice, how a widow and an orphan and an alien should be taken care of. They forgot that covenant and they put the emphasis, they believed in the Davidic covenant that we will have a throne, we will have a dynasty, our nation will be secure, we will come back to the glory that we had in the days of David and Solomon. So they sidelined it. Because of that, there was social disintegration, there was exploitation, the courts were unjust, the judges were corrupt, there was large estates developing. That means they took the property of the poor people, added lands to land, so that they built a bungalow in the middle, and the poor man's land were confiscated, grabbed. The land sharks. That's the first historical evidence of land shark. We'll see that later. And religion was simply a lip service in Judah. Now, it is against this background God sends 4 prophets. 2 ministered in the 8th century in the north, and their names are Amos and Hosea. And 2 during this 8th century ministered in the southern kingdom of Judah. Their names, one Micah and prophet Isaiah. God raised 4 prophets, 2 for each kingdoms. Hosea and Amos for the northern kingdom, and Micah and Isaiah for the southern kingdom. God did not reject his people. God gave them an opportunity. God gave them some time to repent, to come back, so that he don't have to judge them. He don't have to hand them over, his beloved people, to the enemy, the pagan nations. That's why God sent these 4 people. Amos understood or told them the important significance of this gift of prophecy or the ministry of the prophets. At least one passage I should read today is this. That is Amos chapter 2. Turn in your Bibles with me if you would. Amos chapter 2 verses 10 to 11. In verse 10 of Amos chapter 2, Amos is talking about the blessings that God gave these people. All the other traditions, like for example, if you read Psalms and if you read the books of Kings or the first 5 books of Moses, God, they talk about the blessings of God, but they always talk about the material blessings from God. That how God gave them rescued them from Egypt, how God led them through the wilderness, how God gave them the land of Canaan, and that ends there. But Amos says, no, God's blessings are not this land, the deliverance, or leading through this thing, giving you this land. That is not where God's blessings end. God's blessings continues because God raises for you his spokespersons, prophets, and the Nazarites. So you should count that also. That is, God is a God who speaks tenderly to his people to bring them back to himself, to his covenant. That is also, those word of the Lord through the prophets is also, these words are also a blessing from God. So don't disregard it. Let me read that verse. These verses. 2 Amos 2, chapter 2, verses 10 to 11. It was I, Yahweh speaks, who rescued you from Egypt and led you through the desert for 40 years, so you could possess the land of the Amorites. I chose some of you. Now, he says, and then I, in this land, I chose some of your sons to be prophets and others to be Nazarites, so that they can keep warning you, keep you to walk according to the ways of the Lord. I did that blessing as well. But what did you do with the prophets? Can you deny this, my people of Israel? Can you deny this fact that I led you from Egypt? I led you through the wilderness. I delivered you from Egypt. I led you through wilderness. I gave you this land as a possession. And I continued that blessings by raising prophets and Nazarites for you. Can you deny that? No. But what did you do? You rejected the prophets. You made the Nazarites drink wine. Or in another word, you persecuted them. You neglected them. You ignored them. That is the background of the 8th century prophets. We are going to see in the next classes these 4 prophets. What a blessing it was for the people of God. But the book of Kings and Samuel tells us, book of Kings tells us, we have moved away from book of Samuel now to the book of Kings, tells us they did not listen to them. They ignored them. Some persecuted. Some were murdered. Some were put in prison. Jerusalem and Samaria drank lot of blood of the people, the spokespersons of God. Now, this is why I said in the beginning, the book of Samuel and Kings, together with Chronicles, tells us how to lose a kingdom. All that you need to do to lose the blessings that God has given us is simply disregard God's word through his ministers. We don't have to do anything more than that. Just ignore. Have a closed ears and eyes to the word of God, that God speaks through prophets whom he has raised for the blessing of his people. That guarantees the fall. Now, with this introduction, I promise that next week, if we meet again, we will look into the book of Amos, his ministry, and the impact it made in his life and the life of the nation. Until then, God bless you. Amen.